Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video, I'm going to be continuing my analysis of the specifications of the PlayStation 4, formerly known of course as Orbis. In this particular video, I'm going to be talking about the console from the perspective of developers and what Sony's challenges are going to be for the console, what the actual specifications are going to mean for you and I as gamers, and just kind of confirmation and further analysis of the whole situation, really. Obviously, in yesterday's videos, we went over what the actual core components of the console are. This time, I want to go into more what those actually mean for us as consumers, what they're going to mean for developers, and also talk a little bit about how actually the whole thing is tied together in terms of the software and everything else. So, anyway, let's jump right in. So I think we're going to continue to talk about the memory for a little bit. Now, yesterday I mentioned that the PlayStation 4 does indeed feature 8GB, which was a surprise indeed. Very early rumours said the console wasn't going to have much more than 2GB of RAM, and of course that doubled to 4, and then eventually we now have the 8. But what does that actually mean? Obviously, on a very basic level, the more memory you have, the more data that you can actually fit into the memory. In other words, you can have better texture quality, you can have bigger levels, more detail, so forth. That's not really a surprise to anyone. But what does it actually mean in terms of for developers? What challenges are there going to be? Now, anyone will remember the PlayStation 3 did indeed feature a Blu-ray drive, and did indeed feature as well a hard drive. And one of the reasons that Sony actually included the hard drive, although they of course didn't state it publicly, but Blu-ray drives actually have quite a slow read speed, particularly the one that was in the PS3. That's actually one of the reasons why the loading times for the PS3, especially if you don't install, generally are a little bit longer than, say, the Xbox 360. There are a few other reasons as well, mostly to do with the memory configuration, but the primary reason is Blu-ray discs are a little bit slow at reading. However, with the PS4, this is not the case, at least as slow. The PS4 does indeed have a faster drive. It has a 6-speed drive, which is CAV. And for anyone who's wondering what CAV actually stands for, I've neglected to mention that yesterday's video, so sorry about that. It's constant angular velocity. And for anyone who's actually wondering what that is, I'm not going to explain it too much because it's going to take quite a bit of the video, but it's basically the primary way that they read the speed, or should I say measure the speed of drives, in other words Blu-ray or DVD and so forth. Anyway, as I was saying before I interrupted myself, this means you're going to get a maximum read speed of just under 30 megabytes a second, around 27. Bear in mind, however, that that doesn't necessarily mean that's a constant speed. You may get lower access, in other words, lower transfers, shall I say, when different parts of the disk are read. This obviously just depends on how much of the disk is actually used at the time for the games. Now, there are two types of drive that were in contention. There were the 50GB and the 100GB. Now, the 50GB is a dual layer disk, and the 100 is a quad layer. It appears, however, that Sony have gone with the more cost-effective solution. In other words, the 50GB. It's cheaper to produce, it means the discs will be cheaper, and quite honestly, I'm unsure if they're going to be using the 100. 100GB discs are more for the future. They're going to be for 4K video playback. In other words, for the super duper high resolution televisions that aren't really in mass production yet. So there's a good chance that we're going to be using the standard 50GB. That's not really a problem, however. Now, earlier on, I mentioned about the PS3, and the fact that Sony actually included a hard drive was for the fact that many games actually had installs. Now, some of them were blatant about it, and some of them recommended. For example, even, say, Capcom's Super Street Fighter 4 title. You can actually do an install on the hard disk, at least a partial install, and that would load the game up faster. However, other titles, there are a couple of engines in particular that do this. But a lot of them that were guilty of these stealth installs would be, say, Unreal Engine, and of course Skyrim as well on the PS4 as well. And you remember, PS3, and you remember what the whole situation with that was, with the slowdown as the cache become a bit, shall we say, disjointed. I'm not going to go too much into that. Regardless of the fact, because of that, one of the reasons for this was basically to get the data from into the system's memory. a decent speed, obviously, because it has to uncompress. Now, bear in mind that one of the issues we're going to be having right now is that 6-speed Blu-ray drives are great, no problem there. Obviously, it's going to mean a lot higher data throughput, but you've also got to remember that the PS3 had 512 megabytes of RAM. On the PS4, we've bumped this up massively, and it's 8 gigabytes now. So does that mean mandatory installations, and does that mean that we're going to have to kind of sit for 5 minutes? You remember Metal Gear Solid 4 on the PS3? I remember it, and it was a pain in the butt. You just wanted to get into the game, and then you had to just sit there watching Snake smoke for 5 minutes, quite literally, so you had to just go get a coffee. But what I'm basically telling you is that it's very unlikely Sony are going to do this again. They are saying that they want the experience to be as smooth as possible, in quotation marks. So what could probably happen is the game is going to stealth install. In other words, it's going to load up parts whilst like cutscenes are playing, while you first load the game, while say, the game's intro is playing, that type of thing. And it could mean that you can't maybe skip a little bit. It's unknown at the moment. What basically it does mean is that a lot of the easily, shall I say, access data, in other words, the data that the game is frequently going to access, is going to be plopped on the hard drive, and this is, say, the game's main engines, the textures that are consistently used, say, character animations, that type of thing. For example, let's say you're playing as Snake in Metal Gear Solid 6, obviously it's not confirmed, I'm just using it as an example. I don't want anyone to say, hey, someone on Red Gaming Tech said Snake is going to be in Metal Gear Solid 6, and, the whole thing happens, but no, what I'm saying is, say, for example, you're playing as Snake in Metal Gear Solid 6, Snake, his model is probably going to be consistently used throughout. Okay, he might change his suit or whatever, but you get the general idea. His animations are going to be consistent, so stuff like that may partially at least get loaded into the memory, so it saves the console having to do this each time. Now remember, the hard drives themselves, even slow ones, are going to reach much greater speeds of transfer. As I said before, you're looking at around 27 megabytes per second. You're looking at about 4 times that for even the slower hard drives on, say, the PS3. So that means that we're going to be waiting a lot less time. Now, all of this, of course, is an effort to increase the usage of the memory. After all, once again, if you've got 8 gigabytes of RAM, but you simply can't fill it because, well, the access times are too long, it doesn't make a blind bit of difference. Now, I'm not actually sure quite yet how much of this is system reserved. There's been a number of numbers, shall I say, banded about. However, the last time I looked, I think 512 megabytes was the number that most people were saying. So even if you say it's double that, you've still got 7 gigs of RAM reserved for games. And I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying even if it does turn out to be, that's still pretty darn impressive. So what about the CPU? Well, the CPU and the graphics card itself, there are a few small changes here that we weren't really sure about, but I'm going to go into the CPU first, since it actually ties into the whole, shall we say, core of the unit. Now, the CPU is, as I've said yesterday's video, is an AMD Jaguar. Now, AMD's Jaguar, I'm not going to go too much into this, but they're basically high performance, low power devices. Specifically, they'll be used for, say, laptops or tablets, that type of thing. The next generation, very cool technology, and once again, it's 8 core. Now, they are technically speaking x86, however, they do come with 64-bit addressing, and Sony calls this x86 64, that's with a dash in between them. Now, some other things have been formally admitted, shall we say, have been confirmed, and some other things are a little bit surprising. Now, going back for the RAM just for 1 second, we remember that the PlayStation 4 does indeed have 176 gigabytes of bandwidth for the GDDR5 RAM. Once again, there's 8 gigabytes. This means that it's clocked at a fairly darn healthy 5.5 gigahertz, at least effectively, and that's a lot of speed. Once again, this memory, I've reiterated this a trillion times over, but I'm just going to say it one more time. This is not the type of RAM that, generally speaking, you'll be finding on your PC's main motherboard. This will be for your graphics card, and for Sony to have used this amount is very impressive. Now, going back to the graphics card performance for a moment, the graphics card hardware runs at 800 megahertz. Now, we kind of guessed this before. However, you might also remember back in the day that I released a video talking about the compute units. Now, the compute units of the PS4 were strange actually for many people. And they were talking about 18 compute units, and 14 of those would be available for, well, what have you. In other words, whatever they wanted. Graphics cards, applying graphics, drawing textures, what have you. So in other words, there would be everything down to the character on the screen to, press X to start, that type of thing. However, 4 of them were not for this. 4 of them were reserved for compute units. Now, the compute units are typically used for physics. I've mentioned this before in a previous video. Physics are, if you want to see a demonstration of this, you can see in the video physics, and generally speaking, it's used to put in a lot more detail into screens. For example, into games. For example, Batman Arkham City. On the PC, you'll see a lot more smoke textures. Batman's cape flows a lot more effectively. And while at the moment, yes, physics is very, very, very early, it's not being utilized as much as it should be, it is very cool technology, and it does make things such as I've mentioned before, fluid dynamics. This would be smoke, water, and various other textures that move quite smoothly. For example, even the character's hair, it really, really hammers the CPU to do this stuff, at least to a higher level. That's one of the reasons that physics is now being offloaded onto the GPU. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 4 of these units out of the 18 were apparently reserved. In other words, Sony said, well, effectively was saying to developers, that's nice, if you want to use these units or not, that's totally up to you. You have 14 others to do with what you want, but these are reserved for physics or compute, in quotation. However, this appears not to be the case now. And it appears that the official specifications are actually saying there are 18 of these units, and they can, I quote, be freely applied to graphics, simulation tasks, or some mixture of the two. This basically means that if the game requires heavy use of physics, for example, let's say an engine of the future is very heavy on physics but doesn't really require so much graphics card processing power, well, in that case they could, for example, split it, say, 7-7, or sorry, 7-11. I completely, of course, forgot about the other 4 units there in that previous mathematics. I am bad. Anyway, as I was saying, this gives a lot more flexibility towards the developers, and I'm actually all for that. I was a bit surprised on an initial leak when they said that this was not the case. I was very surprised when they said 14.4. This is more in line what the Xbox 720 is supposedly doing. In other words, just saying to the developers, you can use it how you want. However, as you know, there are less GCN cores available, supposedly, on the Xbox 720. Although, once again, this is not confirmed. We have to wait for Microsoft's official specifications. So right now we know that we've got 8 GB of unified RAM. Sorry, I almost forgot to mention that point. Unified RAM, of course, is a complete turnaround from the PS3. PS3, of course, split the RAM evenly, 256 times 2, so now it's 256 for graphics, 256 for main memory. Obviously, in hindsight, Sony wish they hadn't have done that. Developers weren't happy with that at all and much preferred the Xbox's ways of doing things in terms of the memory configurations. However, this has been somewhat remedied, well, completely remedied on the PS4, and now they have 8 GB of memory to frolic around in, I would say. We know a lot about the CPU, we know a lot about the GPU. There are some things that we're still unsure about, however. Earlier on, you'll notice I did neglect to mention how large the hard drive is. In other words, how big is the built-in hard drive onto the PS4. Truth be told, I don't know. I don't think anyone really outside of Sony does know this. If they do, they're probably under NDA. In other words, we can only guess. I'm probably going to guess it's going to be fairly darn large. I don't want to give you guys a number because I don't want you guys to be disappointed. However, I'm probably going to guess it's well over 500 GB. And I can also guess it's going to be a pretty darn fast drive too. Once again, this is all completely and utterly unconfirmed. It's also unsurprising, once again, I said yesterday, we're going to be seeing USB 3 ports. USB 3 ports are, of course, extremely important nowadays. Not so much back in the day, of course, for the PS3, but for now, yes, they're incredibly important. They, in a very simple terms, they're a lot faster, they produce a lot more memory bandwidth. This is very important once again of transfer of large amounts of data over the bus. an example of this, once again, would be, say, for example, you want to use an external drive, you want to, say, peripherals of the future, who knows what are going to be released that's going to require a lot of data. There are, of course, the usual smattering of HDMI and multi-AV out, which of course would be a component, although I think most people will be using HDMI. It's nice to have the option if required. It's also worth noting there's a TOS or optical link confirmed. Now you may remember the aux port. Now we know that that's for the PlayStation 4i, and once again there is a dual cam solution on that device. However, I think I'm also going to talk a little bit about one of the more later announcements, which is effectively turning your console into a cloud-based server. This is going to be really cool. There are a couple of purposes for this. One of them would be to, say, use your second device, let's say for example your Android cell phone or tablet, as a second screen. This is quite nice. UI could be placed there. On a very simple perspective, I think it could be a bit difficult on most devices. For example, let's say you're sitting on your couch. I'm not quite sure how easy it would be in a very simple terms to just look down. It could be good for strategy games. Diablo, for example, could be really good on that, although obviously that's not a strategy game. I just use it as an example. We also know that, of course, the PS Vita is able to function completely and utterly as a second independent screen and console. This means, for example, if someone's hogging up the main TV in your house, you can actually play your PS4 games on your Vita. This is very, very nice indeed. Once again, this appears to only be over Wi-Fi. It does not appear to be over, say, regular networks. There's obviously a reason behind that. Mostly data transfer rate and lag. Speaking of which, yesterday, of course, my Facebook exploded, quite literally, with all my friends who were talking about the PS4. And quite a few of them, actually, a lot more than what I expected, were upset about the rather interesting take on the PS4's backwards compatibility. Cloud-based gaming, in a very simple way, well, cloud-based gaming is... I'm going to say hit and miss. I'm not actually a massive fan of it in some respects, and one of those is lag. Obviously, in certain titles, it doesn't matter so much. For example, if you were to play, say, Final Fantasy VII, it's probably not going to matter about, even a third of a second lag on most situations. I don't want to even think about dodging the lightning bolts on Final Fantasy X, however, with lag. However, it is possible that, for example, the PS4 could more than easily emulate the PS1, PS2, and even the PSP games. Talks are very, very guarded yet whether you'll be able to actually stream PS3 games. There are multiple reasons for this. One would be the internal infrastructure. Imagine trying to emulate effectively that many consoles, that many PS3s. It's not like they can have like a bank of PS3s hooked up. This would have to be emulated on server side, as well as the immense amount of bandwidth it would take. Obviously, PS1 games aren't really difficult. You can emulate a PS1 on very humble systems, to be honest. Even a PS2 doesn't really require that much power. PS3s, on the other hand, that's a different story altogether. Once again, I know a few people have asked, well, why don't they just make it so that the PS4 can play the games? Why don't they just do that? There's a couple of reasons. First, cost. Now, if they were to do the easy approach, and I use easy in massive quotation marks, with PS3, when it was first released, it did have the ability to effectively be backwardly compatible with PS2 games. But that was at a cost. It basically had to integrate some of the circuitry of a PS2 into it. And PS1 and PS2 were the same. PS1, of course, was completely interchangeable with PS2. You could play PS1 games on the PS2, no problem whatsoever. PS4, however, there's a large discrepancy in terms of the hardware, and quite simply put, it would mean that they're going to have to stick in quite a lot of the CPU and everything else that made that console, and even then it's going to require quite a lot of jiggery-pokery software side to make it work. The other option would be very simple, and that would be emulation on the console. However, bear in mind that the PS3s and the PS4's CPUs couldn't be actually much more different if they tried. It's not just a case of birthed by a different mother, it's birthed by a completely different subspecies. It's that different. For one, for example, the PS4's processor has a lot more power in terms of multi-threading. The PS3's, of course, was the cell-based, and it just doesn't really work to do that. That's not to say that they couldn't do that. I'm not saying the PS3 and PS4, sorry, PS4 is completely and utterly incapable power-wise of emulating, although I'm not actually sure if it would. I'm not actually sure the exact amount of power that we require to emulate a PS3. It depends obviously on just how neat they manage to get the code. Obviously emulation, one of the primary things it does do is rely heavily on how neat your emulator is in terms of its effectiveness. I'm not going to go too much into emulation. But what it is to say is not all emulators are created equally, and sometimes there are shortcuts, for example, on how to get games working. You can see different emulators play games at different speed, and this is certainly the case. I'm not going to go too much into that for the legal side. However, that isn't to say that Sony aren't willing to do that in the future. And if they do cloud-based gaming, it could be on launch feature. They're being very cagey on it at the moment. There are quite a lot of really nice functions on the PS4, and one of them is the fact that it seems to be using one low-power ARM core. Now, this is basically to handle standby tasks, such as, for example, downloading games in the background. For example, let's say you purchase something off the PSN store, console updates, so forth. It's basically there just to make your life a hell of a lot easier. One of the main issues I had with the PS3 was the fact that it couldn't really be that much more invasive, particularly on downloading, if it tried. Now it seems that this is not the case. Indeed, I've even read that they want to make it so you can actually stream games as they're downloading. This is very cool technology indeed. It also manages to do things such as saving the game's current state. This means that if the system is shut down, you'll be able to basically access right where you left off. Once again, operating system tasks, you'll be able to, for example, access your web browser before the game, while the game is running. This is completely contrary to what the PS3 was able to do. Obviously, you can access the web browser on the PS3, but you had to shut down the game first. Why? Why was that? It's a very simple reason. Running a web browser, if you're actually press Control or Delete at some point and look at the amount of memory that a task uses, you'll notice the web browser can actually take quite a bit of RAM. Obviously, it depends on which web browser you're using, what page you're looking at, and so forth. Regardless of the fact, I digress a bit, it's still using a memory. Now, let's say, for example, you're a developer and you basically pack as much of the data into that RAM as possible. Well, the console can't then say, hey, you know what? This guy has completely filled my memory with, all 512 megabytes. I'm not being exactly accurate here, but you can't exactly say 512 megabytes used for the game, and now I'm going to load this web. Oh wait, I don't have the space. It's that simple. That's why Sony have gone down the route and said, no, we have to make a divide. We have to allocate a certain amount of memory. Once again, 512 megabytes is banded about here. We're not 100% certain. This is not concrete information yet. Okay, so now I've talked your ear off completely and utterly. What does that mean for you and I if we're sitting down in front of the console and we're going to be loading a title, whether it's a launch title, say Christmas time, or a title in 3 years from now? What does that mean? Well, if you'll do me a favor and go to my channel after this video is finished, you can go and search Crysis 3 on the channel, and you'll see a comparison video between Crysis 3 on the PC and Crysis 3 on the Xbox 360. And I just use Xbox 360 just because there wasn't a particular reason I wasn't picking on it compared to the PS3. Indeed, I imagine the PS3 version would be slightly worse due to the graphics card on the PS3 and the, as I've mentioned, aforementioned RAM problems of the PS3. Regardless of the fact, they're fairly in the same ballpark. Now, you'll notice just how bad the textures are in some areas. Now, that's not to say Crysis 3 on the Xbox 360 or PS3 looks awful. I'm not saying that. It doesn't look terrible. But it definitely looks better on PC. However, PC gamers have been stuck on roughly the same graphics and roughly the same hardware for a while now. Even if you were to have bought a cheaper hardware piece, let's say, for example, you still have a Q6600 which released, and that's an Intel CPU for those of you who aren't familiar, and that's quite old now. I think it was 2007, someone's probably going to say, no, it's 2008 or something in the comments, but I don't remember, it's roughly around then. And you were to have something along the lines of a GTX 460. And once again, I'm just pulling these figures out by butt. you'll probably be able to run at most games, maybe not the highest resolutions, maybe not the highest, specifications, but you'll be able to play quite a lot of them at pretty darn high. And this is simply because console gaming has really held back development. And that's not, I'm not bad-mouthing consoles or anything, it's just a fact of life. There are some games that really do push it, particularly if you have fan-made texture mods, for example, last Skyrim. Crisis 3 does hammer your system to really get the most out of it. I'm talking really, really, really get the most out of it. In other words, high level anti-aliasing and strobic filtering, everything at max, 1080p. You're probably going to need a very, very high-end graphics cards or SLI, depending. But my point being, I completely digressed again, I'm sorry about that. My point being that that's a start of where we're heading. Now, obviously, when the PS4 is finally released, we're going to be looking at a massive difference in terms of actual raw power on the console. It's going to literally leap up, and therefore developers are going to be able to do a lot of cool things. There's been a lot of demos available, and all of them are run at 1080p. As far as I understand it, and that's a very good news indeed. That means the developers are able to say, hey, you know what, this is really easy for the hardware, this is nice. And Sony have obviously bashed them over the head and said it must be 1080p, we have to be a discernible difference from the last generation. You can imagine them, smacking them on the head with a truncheon as they're doing this. There's a purpose. We want the games to look better. We do want games to look amazing. We do want games to be able to, go to that next level. So we're obviously going to be seeing hardware physics. And once again, you can look at the channel and you can see the Unreal demo, next generation Unreal Engine. Of course, Unreal Engine is extremely popular for games developers for multiple reasons. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of it versus the CryEngine, but what I will say to you is that it is a massive difference. The next generation of Unreal is obviously going to have a lot of physics based in it. You're going to be seeing a lot of better graphics, you're going to be seeing a lot better physics, you're going to be seeing much bigger worlds. There is a slight problem with this. I'm going to touch on this more in another video. I don't really want to bog this video down because it's always getting far, 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 far longer than what I originally anticipated, so sorry about this. But one of the problems with this is that despite the fact that games get bigger, as games get larger, as games get more complicated, it becomes increasingly more difficult to make the games lengthy. In other words, to put it mildly, a lot more time is spent, making it look pretty and more, interactive, and not necessarily on the length of the game. I'm not saying that, suddenly a game's going to be 5 hours long. I'm merely saying that is a slight byproduct. However, with better development tools and better development kits, this is going to be less of a problem. In other words, they're going to be able to use more ready-to-go assets, if you will. I'm kind of getting off the point. What I will say, however, is this means that we're going to be seeing a much better looking games. We're going to be seeing games that obviously at the start probably going to rival PC graphics, which is good. I'm actually all for that. I'm a PC hardcore gamer. I don't have any problems to say that I want the graphics of consoles to look like that. Obviously, that's just going to mean that PC technology has to be pushed forward. Why? Because the software then is able to be pushed further. They don't have to worry about low resolutions. They can keep pushing the hardware, and that's great. That's one of the reasons we really haven't seen that much of competition on the hardware side of things, particularly on graphics cards. Obviously, CPUs, that's not really the case. We have had slightly better improvements on the CPU. We obviously had the Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, but to be honest with you, whether you had Sandy, whether you had Ivy, is not that much difference in terms of power. Indeed, in some ways, Sandy Bridge is actually better in terms of overclocking. But I'm completely going off the beaten track here. What I am saying to you is, really, realistically, if you've had your PC for a couple of years, you're not really going to be having too much of a problem running most of the games now, especially if you had bought a reasonable system back then. However, now, things are really, really different. I'm sorry, by the way, if you can hear a little bit of noise in the background. I can't really do much about it. It's construction going outside my house, and yes, it was up the other night until 2 a.m. Making me want to murder people. However, once again, I think I've covered about everything I need to in this particular video. Hopefully, you've left with a little bit of bewilderment, not in terms of what the hell was the guy talking about, but a little bit of bewilderment in what can we really look for in the future, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic. I am amazingly anticipating the PlayStation 4. I'm amazingly excited about the Xbox 720. and I'm amazingly anticipating the next generations of gaming. So with all of that said, this has been a very interesting video to produce. I'm hoping you guys are left with a sense of excitement, because I bloody well am, and I'm going to be ordering the PS4, and I'll definitely be covering it on the channel. Of course, I'll be covering PC stuff. That's not going anywhere. Indeed, we have a lot of exciting stuff planned for you guys. We really do. I don't want to give away too much in this particular video, but there's going to be a lot of really cool stuff, including live streaming. This goes into some of the aspects of the PS4, with being able to jump into games, live streaming, everything like that. We really want to make this a very, very cool channel indeed. So definitely stick around if you're interested in technology, gaming, and you know the drill by now. Indeed, we're also going to be pushing a lot more of the fighting game and competitive gaming stuff. We want to start quite a lot of tutorial stuff as well over the next couple of months. Regardless, I have completely talked your ear off. I've taken about 30 minutes of your time, so I can only thank you very much. So take care of yourselves. Bye for now, and hopefully if you would leave a comment below on what you would like, you know, give us a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And so bye for now and take care.